Ethical principles are the principles that should guide our medical practice. In the midst of the pandemic, never before has this been so much under siege. It is in moments such as this, when we face grave challenges, that we should go back to the principles of medical ethics. Dr. Vijay Raghavan, in a recent article, had written about the need to see the trees for the forests, or the trees for the woods. And he's referring to the difficulty of physicians when they're confronting the public health approach to pandemic in taking care of the individual patients, who he refers to as the trees. So as a practicing physician, we are faced with very difficult situations on a day-to-day. Patients who come to casualty with SARI, who request discharge but cannot go home. Patients who want discharge from the ward, who cannot go home. Patients whose houses are labeled, identity made public. And when patients died, the family does not have the permission to conduct the last rites. ICUs have long waiting lists, and how do you decide who gets the next bed? And the problem of sending off patients from casualty to near certain death. These are some of the challenges that we face as individual physicians. And in the area of research, how do you do a clinical trial when the patient doesn't have a confidentiality to whether they can get admitted or not? So as a physician, this has been a very difficult period. And today's session is to try and discuss these questions, and I hope provide some ways of understanding and thinking about the ethical dilemmas that we face in dealing both with the clinical care, the public health approach, and research in the midst of the pandemic. Even as the epidemic is declining, we have to evaluate the impact of the pandemic on our ethical framework. Where have we stood ground? Where have we failed? And what new ways of thinking about medical ethics have emerged in the context of the pandemic? Today we have three distinguished speakers with us. Two are community health physicians and one is a microbiologist. Dr. Anu Rose, who is going to speak to us first, is a professor of community medicine. She's a trained bioethicist and heads the bioethics department at CMC. She's also in charge of the Javadi project of the community health department, which works in the tribal areas near Vellore. Dr. Sushil John is also a professor of community medicine. He works in the low-cost effective care unit. He's recently completed a degree on medicine, ethics, and law. And he is also the vice principal of HR at CMC. Dr. Gagandeep Kang is a microbiologist. She heads the Wellcome Laboratory in the GI Sciences Department. She works on GI pathogens, but has also been active in COVID-19 epidemiological studies and plays an important advisory role in the vaccine trials on COVID-19. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Anuradha Rose for her presentation.
Good afternoon, and I'm happy to be here to discuss with you some of the ethical issues which we have been facing, and I'm sure many of you have been facing over the course of this pandemic. So this year, 2020, can only be called as a humanitarian crisis, I think, because all over the world, people who have been suffering are suffering more. People who have been living in a certain amount of comfort have been pushed into poverty, and all problems which the world has been facing has become aggravated. There is more displacement of people, food shortage has become more and more real, risks of malnutrition have increased, and mental health problem and poor access to essential services has become something which is much more than what it was before. If you look at the World Health Report, it says that 9.7 million children will drop out of school this year alone. They have dropped out of school this year alone because of no access to online classes. 132 million people will face hunger daily. And as in our country, as we all know, when we are reading the papers, the problems which the migrant laborers faced during the months of May, June and July, when they were stuck in their places of work with no access to salary or food, was really a huge crisis. In the healthcare field also, there have been unprecedented demands on us. And everywhere, the healthcare system has faced new challenges. The COVID crisis itself, the disease being relatively new, left us with few lessons from the past. So in most places, doctors are learning from what is happening on a day-to-day basis. Problems which have always been there, like unequal access to healthcare determined by people's economics or geographic location of where they live, has been compounded by this crisis. Things which we have achieved over a long period of time, like our immunization rates, access to antenatal care for women in remote areas, have all fallen back. Children the immunization program itself has been affected because most staff in most of the government hospitals and private hospitals have been recruited into COVID care. And this lack of access to health care is not only for COVID patients, people who are suffering from the disease, but also people who had access to healthcare before for common diseases like hypertension and diabetes now find that they are not able to access their routine care. And to compound all of this, every day we read in the newspapers about an increase in the abuse of medical professionals. People who are afraid of this disease are afraid that medical professionals carry the disease more than others. And all the common problems which medical professionals have been facing has become more with this crisis. So if we look at the most common ethical issues we are facing because of this crisis, they all seem to fall under these three big headings. One is an allocation of resources which are scarce and which is now forcing medical practitioners to ration out resources. The whole doctor-patient relationship is sort of we've gone back in time to what we were many years back. And the issue of healthcare personal safety has again become a big crisis. So if we look at the health system capacity, before the COVID crisis, at best, we were able to provide healthcare for most of the people, but we all know that there are many states where people have lack of access to even basic health facilities like immunization and antenatal care, lack of access to common medication for diseases like chronic disease medicines. And in this pandemic, we're now faced with a new disease where medicines were not accessible, where there were newspaper reports of some drugs which seemed to be working but were not available in our country, and a lot of anxiety among the people. So compounded by that, we know that already we don't have adequate beds, adequate hospitals to meet the healthcare needs of the entire country. So in the pandemic, who gets the resources? How do we decide in an ethical manner what value should we use for rationing out the resources which we have so that everybody's healthcare needs are met? So rationing itself is not a very pleasant thing, but unfortunately has to happen and somebody has to make the decisions. So when we read the papers, we read about the governments talking about who would get vaccines. Certain governments we know have spoken saying that the whole state is going to get vaccines free. So rationing happens at a macro level. In the early days of the pandemic, there were newspaper reports about lack of access to PPE and the steps the government was taking to access PPE from various companies and sometimes from other countries and make it available to the doctors who were in the front line. So on a macro level, looking at policies about who will access healthcare, there is rationing happening. On the micro level, all of us are familiar with the day-to-day micro level rationing which happens. Who gets the last bed which is available? If we have a shortage of drugs, how do we ensure that the people who need it most get it most? So that is from the side of the patients. On the side of the staff, for this disease, since a proportion of the patients needed specialized ICU care, many hospitals found that they had to decide how they would ration out their staff so that the people who could work in ICUs were used in ICUs, whereas others could work in other settings. In the beginning of the pandemic, there was a shortage of personal protective equipment, and rationing that out also was an issue. And now we are in a phase where we are talking about the availability of a vaccine, and there are lots of discussions about who will have access to the vaccine in the beginning, because it is illogical to expect that everybody will have access at the same time. So who should be the people who would first be vaccinated? The other issue is, I'm sure all hospitals have faced some amount of a financial crisis because of a lack of access to healthcare. Patients are just not going, which means that hospitals are not making adequate money to run the hospitals and pay their staff. So rationing, even before the pandemic, rationing happens on a daily basis in almost all healthcare settings. Doctors have to decide about giving concessions, who to give concession to if we have a limited amount of money. Like I talked about before and what Dr. Anand also said, how do we ration out ICU beds? So there are some fundamental principles which are commonly used. There are many principles, but these four ones are commonly used. Usually people try to maximize benefits. So if you have a certain amount of money, you make sure that that is used for the maximum benefit for most people. If you look at how to treat people, people ought to be treated equally. So if somebody comes to a hospital and there are limited resources, everybody should have the same chance of accessing healthcare or accessing those resources. There has been a lot of literature which talks about promoting and rewarding instrumental value. What I mean by that is, if there are, in some countries, if a person has taken part in a clinical trial, for example, and was willing to take on risks for the sake of other people reaping the benefits of research, then they are given some priority to be vaccinated or to obtain some resource which is scarce. Or for example, people who put themselves in the front line, like doctors who work in the front line, the police, other services which are essential for society to go on, should be given some reward and offered a priority. And very often, and unfortunately, the people who are unlikely to survive or are unlikely to benefit from a huge amount of investment are not given a very high priority. In the pandemic itself, the way things were rationed were actually slightly different. So while previously, ethically, there was always a lot of talk on looking at the personhood of people and not basing allotment of resources based on any other criteria and treating everybody as equal because they are all persons. That changed a bit because of the shortage, the drastic shortage. People were forced to prioritize only those with the best outcomes. So if there were people who were unlikely to survive, and there were a lot of newspaper reports on this in the beginning of the outcome in certain countries like Italy, which went through the pandemic early, elderly people were not allowed admission to hospital itself. They were advised to stay at home, and if they recover, they recover. If they don't, then it was left. The second thing is, since this is a new disease and every day there is a huge amount of research going on, the practice has been changing. Even in the last 6 months, the way this disease has been treated has been changing. So evidence-based practice is probably important because we should not be wasting our resources on something which has already been proved to be not the best possible treatment. Again, high priority for frontline workers. Frontline workers are not just doctors. They are all people who put themselves in the front line to make society run smoothly, like the police personnel, the people who work in essential services like the railways and so on and so forth. Another common way in which rationing was done was first comes, first served. So you go to a hospital, and if there is a bed available, you are admitted. If there is no bed, you are sent to some other hospital. But in this particular case, in the pandemic, the first come, first served type of rationing was sort of looked down on because, like I mentioned before, those with better outcomes are prioritized to have a higher chance of receiving care. The other important thing is that just because the pandemic is going on doesn't mean the other diseases are not there. So now COVID and non-COVID patients who need essential care should have an equal chance of receiving their essential care, so that lives are not lost by people dying due to other diseases because we are trying to save people who have COVID. So these are all hard decisions and very difficult for doctors, nurses, and anybody in the front line to be put in a position to decide who gets medicines and who doesn't get, who gets to be saved and who doesn't get. So this has added terribly to the distress which the healthcare people have been facing over this pandemic. The second thing about the pandemic is that it has entirely set us back by a few decades in the way we deal with patients. So the doctor-patient relationship itself has progressed over the last few years from being one of paternalism to shared decision making. So a few decades back, the doctor would probably make all the decisions for the patient based on his own experience and his knowledge. And that has changed. And in most places, there is a lot of emphasis on the patient's autonomy to decide and the patient's capacity to actually make the best decision themselves. And shared decision making is what happens when the doctor discusses everything with the patient and sometimes the patient's family and then makes a decision. And in this pandemic, we all know that actually the patient's wishes are not getting fulfilled. People are being admitted when they don't want to get admitted. Dr. Anand had told me a couple of stories of patients who came to the hospital, were tested because they had symptoms, and then had to be forcibly admitted and not allowed to go home because the result had not come. So the doctor is usually the advocate for the patient, and in this situation, we are now being forced to listen to what the government has deemed as best for the population, rather than what is best for the individual patients. And the ethical dilemmas which this has brought about is that we are now forced to share data which previously we had thought of as confidential. We are forced to send patients' names, family members' names, addresses to the government, and very often this is sometimes coming out in the papers also. So privacy and confidentiality, which we thought we should be protecting under all circumstances for the well-being of the patient, is now lost. The second thing is the doctor is put in a position where we are sort of confused where our fiduciary duty lies. Is our duty with the well-being of the patient, or should we be answering to the state? Because the state has made certain rules, Sushil will talk about it later, which forces doctors to actually give out information about patients and their privacy. And so where does our duty lie? And of course, the issue of beneficence to individuals, where you would like to do your best for this particular individual. But then there is the issue of justice in the pandemic, where others are also there and probably in a worse situation. So finally, the third point is about the healthcare worker-patient relationship. Again, in this situation, because of the infective nature of this disease and because of the quarantine law, which Sushil will talk about, patients are now isolated from their family, and all patients under stressful circumstances of being admitted need their family around. They have physical needs, emotional needs. Many of them are afraid of death, because that is what the papers talked about in the beginning of the pandemic. And spiritual needs. And it is very difficult to address these needs when the patient is isolated from family and isolated from other healthcare personnel also. Because the people who generally provide all these services for the patient are not able to access the patient because of the need for isolation. And with the family also being in quarantine when a patient is diagnosed as positive, who does the doctor communicate with about the condition of the patient? Who takes care of the bills? So and then the whole issue of people who are very sick dying alone and having afterlife services which were not within their list of wishes. So in this picture on top, there is a lady who has the facility to actually talk to her family on a audiovisual device, and in some countries this has been possible. In CMC also, many patients were able to talk to their relatives on a cell phone which was provided by the healthcare personnel. But in many places, people actually did die alone without seeing their family members at all. People were not able to carry out the last rites and rituals which how they would have liked to carry it out. All this has added to the moral distress among healthcare workers. So medical staff have been stepping up into the roles of family members and caregivers much beyond what they have been doing 1 year before, when the pandemic was not there. And all this with a heightened exposure to human suffering, to death, and only because we don't have the resources to treat people who could actually be saved. So when we talk about death, there's not only death due to the COVID pandemic, but also preventable deaths due to other diseases because patients were not able to reach hospitals. And compounding all this is the poverty and social inequity, which has contributed to the death, not because they were moribund and sick alone, but because of social inequities. So the other important thing is that doctors live in a society, they are part of a society. So all the other issues which they faced, like other people who have turned positive in the community, were faced by medical personnel also, like doctors being evicted from their homes because people were afraid that they are carrying the disease. And everything caused by fear of this new disease. So the moral distress faced by the healthcare personnel has been quite huge. So my last slide, some suggestions which we have come up with and tried to use to help our own healthcare staff, which may be useful for you in your own setting. It is important that we adhere to a value system where we pay equal importance to care and to cure, because in many instances, care is all we can do, even if we cannot cure. The other thing to be mindful is that if all staff are involved in some way, it is good. In my own department, there were many staff who were very, very afraid of the disease, didn't want to have anything to do with COVID care work. But they were posted in some areas in the hospital where they were responsible for distributing PPE and so on and so forth. And at the end of that, they felt that they were proud that they were able to contribute in some way to this COVID work. And like I said, our doctors in many hospitals, including CMC, have stepped up to become family members. We've come up with new ways to encourage patients to connect with their families, like AV devices being used in the ICUs. We've involved counselors and chaplains to help with the counseling of patients who were distressed. For staff, it is very important to have counseling services and debriefing opportunities because of the huge amount of moral distress they're facing. The other important thing is to make clear guidelines for the hospital for allocation of resources so that the staff don't feel morally responsible at the end of the whole thing for the inability to provide for people who need. And last but not the least, even though there were lots of rules about family visiting patients, it is important to allow closure and to allow the family with using adequate amount of protection to visit dying patients and have time to say bye, and also help with arranging for the funeral. Most important, let us all believe that we should not be facing this with fear but with faith. And thank you for your patient hearing. Questions at the end?
Yeah, at the end. Thank you very much, Anu, for that excellent presentation. We're going to move on now to Dr. Gagandeep Kang's presentation.
So, thank you very much for asking me to speak here. It's a little difficult to follow Anu because she's done such a brilliant job of talking about what many of the issues are. And they overlap quite a bit with some of the issues that relate to the conduct of ethical research in COVID-19 patients. So the question really is, why should we do clinical research? Why can't we find potential diagnostics, drugs, or vaccines, wait for other people to develop them and use them in our populations? And when it is a new disease, there really isn't the availability of diagnostics, drugs, or vaccines that we can get from anywhere else. They have to be developed pretty much in real time as we are handling the clinical aspects of managing patients and the public health aspects of preventing transmission of the disease. So the questions really are, when we do clinical research, does this benefit the patient who participates in the research, or does it benefit other future patients who have a similar condition? Does it benefit the population? And what are those benefits at each level, as well as what are the burdens and the risks of research on individuals, on groups, on communities, and even on researchers who frequently have multiple responsibilities that they need to handle. So why do we do clinical research? We do clinical research because it gives us hope. Hope that we will be able to detect disease more easily. We will have drugs that can manage our patients, and we will have vaccines that will prevent these diseases. Now, when we look at the types of clinical research that are done in a pandemic, that are being done now, they are obviously treatment, prevention, diagnosis, screening, looking at what is happening once patients have recovered, examining long COVID syndrome, looking at the quality of life. And there are a range of different kinds of epidemiologic studies that are done. So every form of clinical research that we know is being implemented here. Now, clinical research is clearly needed because whether it is demography or the environment or genetics, all of these shape our response to an infectious disease. And we are required to have medical management that is developed to be tailored to the target individual and the target populations. But when we think about clinical research, we have this large picture, but it should not take away from patient-centered ethical research that maximizes the potential for benefit to the individual and the population. I think the development of new tools, new diagnostics, new treatments, new vaccines is essential. But I also think that research is very important for preventing false hope. Anu had brought up the issue of drugs and that are unproven being used for prophylaxis and for treatment. And these are very serious issues because people who have the idea that drugs and vaccines are going to work when they are not, have a false sense of security, a false sense of hope that there is a solution to their problems. So when we think about research, I think there are two key issues that we need to think about at the individual level and at the population level. At the individual level, it's autonomy and engagement. How do you ensure that the person who is participating in research has the ability to make the right decisions and is a partner in the research, not being subjected to research? And then when we look at the population, I think we need to think about what approaches to research really benefit the community. In China, there were 120 trials that were started in the first 6 weeks of the pandemic, and none of them wound up being completed. A few were published, but published without the projected sample size, and even those sample sizes were relatively small. So when we think about ethical research in a pandemic, what are the areas that we need to consider? Obviously, ethics review. IRBs need to be strengthened. We need to have the ability to call on appropriate expertise when it's not available. We need to maximize research and resource priorities, and it should be fit for purpose. Does it make sense for us to test monoclonal antibodies, for example, if they are going to be unaffordable to the bulk of our population? They may be useful in private healthcare settings. So then is that the only place where we should be trying out these kinds of treatment? Respect for patient autonomy and engagement is something that I've brought up already, and we'll walk through that in a little more detail in the next couple of slides. I think for participants when there is a pandemic like this, it's very important that the participant information is as complete as possible. We have to provide to them a clear understanding of what the potential benefits and risks are. And also, if we don't know if there are going to be benefits or we don't have an understanding of risks, then we need to provide that information to participants. Community engagement is one critical aspect of research that does not get enough airtime. We tend to focus on the individual and their participation. But when we think about clinical trials, we don't really think about the community from which the individuals are drawn. And that is very important when we are thinking about an infectious disease in the context of a pandemic. And for researchers, managing conflict of interest is critical because you want to make sure that there is no question of bias when it comes to doing the studies, whether it is, to be discoverer of a new test or somebody who finds a new treatment or develops a new vaccine. It really is the patient's and the community's interests that need to come first before that of the researcher. Now, this is just an example of what participant engagement should look like. This is workflow for informed consent for a COVID-19 study and how you can think about doing this in a hospital setting. So it starts with whether there is a counselor available to request informed consent, if it can be recorded without contamination risk, whether the patient is in good enough health to give consent, and then if everything runs smoothly, you can think about getting the consent. If this is not possible, there need to be alternate strategies of delaying consent or asking family members for consent to participate. There are a number of different ways of approaching consent, particularly in the context of an emergency. This can be prospective informed consent. So if you have a patient who comes in who may deteriorate in the future and then be eligible for a trial, then you can obtain consent ahead of time. You can also get certain forms of waived consent where you can get it at a population level. This, in most cases, will not apply as much to COVID-19 now, but may apply at a stage when we are thinking about other prevention strategies, including vaccines, which might require a waiver of community consent, but individual consent can proceed. Now, waived consent can happen for low risk studies and can occasionally happen in the case of emergencies, where, for example, if you're recruiting patients into a study where the procedure that you're going to do is going to be life-saving, then it might be possible to think about enrolling them into the study with IRB approval with waiver of consent. Deferred consent is also possible when consent is taken after enrollment into the study. And then you can also get consent from representatives and family members. Usually written consent is required, but in certain special circumstances, institutional review boards can permit for verbal consent to be taken instead of written consent. Now, why this is my favorite example of why we should be doing clinical research in the context of COVID-19. And this is data from the recovery trial, and similar data has now been shown by the Solidarity trial. If you look at what was happening in India, we had hydroxychloroquine being promoted as a prophylactic, as a treatment. When it didn't work in severe disease, we were told it would work in mild disease, that it would work as a prophylactic. But all of this was based on so-called expert opinion or experience that had come from in vitro studies. And the same happened for lopinavir, ritonavir, and for remdesivir. Now, it was only when we had the recovery trial that we found that hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir did not work at all in patients who had severe disease and were hospitalized. And dexamethasone resulted in a 1/3 reduction in deaths. Now, why is the recovery trial and the Solidarity trial really important to discuss as a matter of ethics? It's important because these trials give us answers. If you look at the clinical trials registry of India, there are over 200 studies that are registered for COVID-19. These studies have 50 participants, 100 participants, 150 participants. You know you're not going to get answers from that. If you look at the results here for dexamethasone come from 2,000 participants. That's the size of trial that you need for a really robust answer to a question. Does it work or does it not work? Now, when you have a situation where you weigh really large studies against small studies, how do you get the large studies done? The only reason that recovery was able to happen was because all the NHS hospitals in the UK were asked to stop individual trials and work together to be able to recruit patients for recovery. Similarly, in the Solidarity trial, WHO had asked countries to make sure that there were hospitals that could recruit patients into the arms of the Solidarity study. When you need robust answers to questions about drugs that work, I think the only way to do this is to do really large, well-powered study. If we do smaller studies that are not going to be resulting in a clear answer, that may satisfy our egos that we were principal investigators on a trial, but it's actually unethical to be recruiting patients into a trial where you are unlikely to be able to demonstrate benefit. Research is done to generate generalizable data. And if you are not doing research that is going to have an outcome that will benefit patients in the future, we should not be doing it. So in the UK, what has happened now is that the NHS hospitals have been told that they are not to do individual level trials, that all trials will be approved centrally, and patients that need to be recruited into these studies will be recruited centrally. With the number of cases that is going up in the UK right now, there are 2 new treatments that are being tried out. And I anticipate, because of the way these studies are going to be done, we will have clear answers from them. So just to summarize what we need to be thinking about when we want to do ethical research in COVID-19 patients, the scientific question has to be relevant. It has to be something that suits the patient population that we are working with. There is no point in trying treatments that are unlikely to be available to the participants in research at our sites. We need to have a reasonable risk-benefit profile. As far as we know, we should be minimizing risks as much as possible, maximizing benefits. There needs to be individual and community level engagement, and that is at the individual level, families and communities. This is particularly true when we are thinking about vaccine trials that need to be done in community settings. Participant selection needs to be fair. When resources are limited for recruiting patients for trials that might have potential benefit, then every patient who comes to a facility should have an equal chance of participating in the study. We have to make sure that we have suitable sites with experienced investigators who know when to take a patient off an investigational protocol. The idea of doing a rescue has not applied very much in the kinds of clinical research that is being done with COVID-19 because we haven't had rescue medication available. But that is likely to change with the new antivirals and treatment strategies that we have now. We need robust informed consent. People need to understand what the potential risks and benefits are. They need to understand that they can leave the trial at any time. And particularly for India, one thing that is really important is clinical protocols for research need to define compensation for study-related harms. Having clarity on these issues makes it much easier for the investigators as well as ethics committees and participants to know ahead of time what is going to happen in case there is a study-related injury. Given the situations that we are in right now, it's not likely to be very frequently. Nonetheless, this is something that we have to be prepared for. So there are a lot of issues related to ethical research in this context, and particularly for our setting. But if we have enough communications between researchers, between participants, between communities, I think these are issues that we can deal with. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Cherry, for that strong plea for ethical scientific research to answer questions so that it will benefit patients. I hope there will be more questions related to the issues that patients actually face and doctors face in being involved in clinical trials in the discussion. So we move to our last presentation by Dr. Sushil John on the law and COVID-19.
Thank you, Anand. And so we'll move on to the third of this series of talks for today, which is the law and the legal implications on patient care during COVID. So we'll briefly look at the two acts that have come into play, and then we'll look at a few of the Indian Penal Code sections that are more relevant now. And we'll look at government notifications, legal implications for patient care. And I'll leave you with some comments and questions as food for thought. And you'll notice that I'll be echoing and maybe just describing a little more of some of the components that Anu spoke about and a few of what Dr. Gagandeep spoke about. So the first act is the Epidemic Disease Act, which is from the 19th centuries, brought about in the late 1800s to address the bubonic plague at that time. And what's relevant to us is the powers that are given to the government when they can actually enforce this and what they can do. So if at any time the country or a state or a part of, or they feel that a part of any part of the state has a risk of a dangerous disease of epidemic nature, and the existing rules and laws that are in place at that time are insufficient to address and control the particular epidemic in question, then the state can actually bring in this act and can take all necessary measures that they seem fit to bring about various rules and regulations to address this particular epidemic. So at the state level, the state can actually prevent movement of people and implement various restrictions, have various guidelines for hospitals and healthcare facilities. At the national level, the center can actually, will actually be able to control port of entries at international international port of entries for our country. Failure to comply with this act will lead to someone being able to be booked under what is called Section 188 of the Indian Penal Code, and where there's punishment, fine or jail time. Now, there's an interesting thing that all government personnel who perform their duties under this act in good faith are actually protected from any litigation. And I'm sure that most of us in the healthcare facilities would actually want something similar to that kind of a protection. There was an amendment in 2020, and I think many people are hoping that it would be an amendment to actually address specific issues related to COVID, but it actually brought about, I think, I can't remember, one of the earlier speakers mentioned about acts of violence against healthcare service personnel, which seems to be a particular disease that we have in India. The second act is the Disaster Management Act, which was actually brought in 2005 to address natural or man-made disasters, which the pandemic COVID-19 is not doesn't actually fit in, but this is what we have and this is what the government has chosen to go with. And this enables the government to actually enforce the lockdown that we've had and thereby restrict public movement. It also kicks in the three-tiered national disaster management program that we have at the national, state and district level, allows the various bodies to perform their various duties and utilize the particular funds that they have for this. Now, because there were no medicines at the initial part and what is called non-pharmaceutical interventions are what the government undertakes to try and prevent the epidemic spread. And so there were travel restrictions, all public transport was stopped, all private transport was heavily restricted, and only essential services were allowed. And even that, there was tremendous difficulty for people to be able to perform even essential duties. Closure of all public facilities, including educational institutes, markets. There are advisories on social distancing, which many people prefer to call physical distancing. Regulations regarding isolation of patients and quarantine of people who come into contact with patients, and including the sealing off of areas either in particular zones or individual houses, which a lot of people will argue there are human right violations. There are about 5 of the sections of the Indian Penal Code that are relevant to the particular situation that we're in, and I mentioned about the section 188 earlier, and section 144 helps the government and the police to actually prevent gathering of 4 or more people at a particular place. Sections 269 and 270 talk about when people perform acts either negligently, unknowingly, or even purposefully or malignantly, and people who do perform these such acts, which are likely to spread the disease, and in this particular situation, COVID, they can be punished. And naturally, the people who do any of these particular kinds of acts purposely or malignantly have a much stricter punishment. Failure to follow quarantine rules, you can be booked under section 271 with jail time. So some issues for us to think about are the 19th Century Epidemic Disease Act and the Disaster Management Act, are they sufficient and responsive enough to the pandemic that we have? Who benefits from retaining these acts and not legislating new ones that are well thought out, and who loses? What are the legal implications of the national lockdown, which was instituted with only 4 hours of notice, while actually the country had 4 days of notice for the Janata curfew on a Sunday? Many implications of initiating the lockdown without putting into place specific mitigating actions which are mandated by the Disaster Management Act. And what are the public health and ethical implications of the government stand that there was no community transmission? And finally, does this violence against health personnel apply only in an epidemic situation? And moving on to various guidelines and its implications for healthcare facilities and for clinical care, it's the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and the various associated sections of the government that have been over time and with evolution of our knowledge, issuing notifications, and I'm sure between the center, state, and the districts, there must have been thousands of notifications by now. So broadly looking at some of these guidelines with regard to screening and tracing, so all hospitals and healthcare facilities have to have separate areas for the screening of suspect COVID patients. And once a patient is diagnosed to have COVID-19, there have to be specific beds and areas and wards allotted for these patients. The travel history of people, initially who travel from other countries, and later on who travel within the country in various red zones and hot zones, had to be reported. And history of contact with either suspects or confirmed cases had to be recorded and shared with the State Integrated Disease Surveillance Unit through the collector. And I'm sure at the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdown, the administration, probably the medical superintendent's office, was having daily meetings with the collector. With regard to testing and quarantine, there's been a lot of confusion and with testing, and the government only authorizes particular labs to actually take samples and conduct these tests. And many of you are aware of the lot of problems with this. With regard to quarantine and isolation, people were expected to self-quarantine for 14 days in case someone had traveled to an area affected by COVID, and if they were asymptomatic. If they were symptomatic, they would have to be tested, and if positive, would have to be isolated as per the protocols of that particular state or district at that particular time. There's one other guideline, which some people call gag orders, because the government said that no person or organization will be able to use any print or electronic media for information regarding COVID-19 without prior permission from the Department of Health and Family Welfare. So the less I say about this, the better, I think. One good thing that has happened is that now the government has actually come out with telemedicine practice guidelines 2020, for which there was none before, and which there have been quite a few cases in the courts. And this enabled us to some extent to help patients who couldn't travel because of the restrictions in place, and at least get online health consultations. So at CMC, we've been very fortunate that the administration and through the COVID Command Center, they have been able to actually, in somewhat real time, share all these updates and notifications as they evolved over time with the CMC faculty. And I'm sure many of the larger institutions and some others were able to actually do similar kinds of information sharing and trickle down to all their personnel. But there would have been many hospitals and private facilities which were not capable of doing this. And so some medical, legal, and ethical implications from these kind of notifications, guidelines, and the way the government has actually reacted. And Anuradha mentioned about the issue of PPE, and the state and any employer or hospital is actually obligated to provide adequate PPE to its personnel so that they can function, do their normal functions that are expected of them with safety to themselves and not put themselves in harm's way. And that was a huge issue, and we are fortunate now in CMC to actually be well equipped, but in many parts of the country, this is still a big problem. And we are even aware that in many developed countries, people had to resort to using garbage bags and other things to try and do some PPE. By being forced to follow the law, which has been brought in by the Epidemic Act and Disaster Management and restriction of public movement, we've actually had to neglect our regular and non-COVID patients and putting them in harm's way and at risk of complications. And so there have been numerous studies showing 50% drop in immunization rates, 50% drop in antenatal care and institutional delivery rates. There are many studies about the effects on psychiatric patients, increase in stress for everyone, people on chronic disease medication. There are a lot of studies showing how congestive heart failure patients have tremendous worsening of morbidity because of lack of access of healthcare. Elective procedures were put on hold and cancelled, and while some of them it's okay to postpone, everyone is aware that some do need to have some time. Closure of OPDs and hospitals have happened. Certain hospitals were closed when COVID was found either within staff or within patients, and they were actually not equipped to look after such patients. Another issue is that when hospitals were designated as COVID, able to or allowed to treat COVID hospitals, that exposed staff and non-COVID patients to COVID patients. And this kind of happened, I think, to CMC, where we were called a COVID hospital, and so patients tried to avoid coming to CMC. Many hospitals and health facilities were forced to actually look after COVID-19 patients with limited resources. And so this has led to a lot of moral distress, and the healthcare facilities actually having to drop their standards to look after this particular situation. Supply chains to hospitals have been tremendously hit during the initial part of the lockdown when essential services were hit badly. and hospital waste management chains were disrupted, and our own department, our own institution had great difficulties in trying to maintain these chains. Something that I think Dr. Kang mentioned, and maybe Anu also, that there's been a variety of claims on prevention and cure, both in allopathy and in other forms of medicine. And so, essentially this is basic, forms of quackery. And so I see patients who come to us in the low-cost effective care unit with bottles and packets from the Ayush Ministry, saying that these arsenic medicines will actually will prevent you from getting COVID. There's this kashayams that are being forced on people who are being stopped on the road, being given in schools when they were. I'm sorry, that is for dengue. But there is kashayams that are being delivered now also. And then there's this famous Baba Ramdev's coronal pan-India trial and 100% cure in 7 days and all kinds of stuff. So there is a WHO website that addresses this, where you can actually go and do a fact check or even report it to the WHO wherever this is coming. And thankfully, the Indian government has actually stopped many of these advertisements and these kind of claims from carrying on. So with the Epidemic Disease Act, in some states, the government has actually taken over some of the hospitals as COVID centers, or they've told hospitals to actually allot a certain percentage of beds. So when this happens, are the payments that are made to the private hospitals adequate? Payments are made under the Ayushman Bharat scheme. And so are these really adequate? For us in CMC and for many of the mission hospitals, patient care is the normal source of revenue. And so when that takes a big hit, when patients can't come, and we're expected to continue functioning, who pays the salary, and what about the running costs of the institution? And as was mentioned before, families were denied last rites of people who died of COVID, which is in violation of human rights and in violation of the ICMR and the WHO protocols for disposal of dead bodies. So to summarize, in India we have 2 acts, the Epidemic Disease Act and the Disaster Management Act, and protocols are in place. And the collector is in charge of the district level control measures. There were many issues that we have not actually discussed with the lockdown, and opportunities for people's welfare were missed out, leading to tremendous both socioeconomic and health negative outcomes. The government has regular notifications as the situation evolves, and all facilities have to strictly comply with these guidelines. And each facility needs to design their own measures which comply with the government notifications. Thank you. I hand over to Anand.
While people put in their questions, Anu, one question to you. One thing I noted was that while there were so many ethical violations taking place, if you looked at there was actually a lack of discussion on how we have to think about medical ethics in the time of a pandemic in the mainstream, both in the press as well as in hospital. Could you just comment on that? Why there was no discussion? Because serious violations were taking place. Would you like to comment?
So I think the fact that the pandemic, in the beginning of the pandemic, there was so much of emphasis on trying to prevent deaths, and there was a lot of fear that in a country like India, because of the large population, that we should be expecting a lot of people falling sick and a lot of people dying. And also the fact that a country like the United States, where we sort of assume that healthcare services are very good, and we found that there also there was a lot of issue with the resourcing, resource management. That took precedence over actually looking at individual people's rights, and the ethics of patient care itself did not come into the forefront. The second thing, like you pointed out, it was very surprising that people in hospitals totally lost their autonomy. and not much discussion happened about it. But then once it became an act, like the Epidemic Act was brought in, it became nearly impossible for hospitals to actually try and protect the ethical aspect of patient care, because it became a legally punishable offense, and no hospital wanted to be sealed or to have its administrators jailed. So I think that was one of the main reasons why. So that's what I was saying in the beginning. This has sort of set us back in about a few decades. Like the way we practice ethical medicine has gone back by a few decades because of this pandemic.
So would you suggest that there should be more writing and thinking and speaking about the ethical issues? Now, the other thing which, as physicians we were faced with was this, you're trained to take care of the patient, and then you're forced to look at the interest of the public versus the patient. Now, what is your advice as an ethicist on how physicians should understand and cope with these dilemmas?
So again, a very difficult situation, because from the time students join medical college, we are taught about the fiduciary duty of a doctor, that it should be to the individual patient, and that is what the Hippocratic Oath also tells us. And we are sort of brought up in the field of medicine to believe that we are the advocates for the patient, and the patient is our primary. We are responsible to the patient first. And here we are in a situation where we have to actually put the well-being of the patient second, and place the instructions given by the government first. So basically it's a sort of conflict between an individual patient's autonomy and the public good, because the government is not being unreasonable. That is their method of trying to prevent the epidemic from blowing up too much. So public good versus individual autonomy, and in most situations it is public good which would trump individual autonomy. Because of our state of resources, we will not be able to manage a huge demand on resources, and therefore it is necessary for people to give up their autonomy in order for public good. But maybe if things were a little more well thought out and implemented in a more patient-friendly way, it would have been more easy for people. But then we are all learning on the go. So
saying keep the bigger picture and try and understand the difficulties that you're facing in that, and then try and do the best for the individual patient in front of you. You talked a lot about the issue of rationing, and what would you say are the learnings from COVID-19 in terms of the ethical principles to guide rationing in the context of a pandemic? I don't think there's been any pandemic which has stressed the healthcare system so much in recent times. And people, from the ICUs to admissions to equipment and so many things you have elaborated on. But what would you say are the learnings of those principles? I mean, when we actually did them, we found some difficulties. So what are the learnings that you would say?
So I would think that in the non-pandemic situation, when we did not have to really worry too much about resources, there was a lot of emphasis on the personhood of people, and a value-based rationing where everybody is treated equally, and every person, irrespective of their age or their comorbid condition, or anybody has an equal access to medication. But in this situation, we are sort of forced to see that a value-based rationing has not been possible. Rather, it is sort of a utilitarian type of approach to ethics, where if you want to benefit the maximum number of people, then it is the most vulnerable, and also the people with the most comorbidity and so on and so forth, who will not be getting access. And when you look at a value-based type of ethic, this does not sort of go very well. But the lesson to be learned is that we should not sacrifice the good in the search of the ideal. Like, under the given circumstances, we should do as much good as possible. Sometimes searching for the ideal means that we are going to lose more people. So the easiest way to go about it would be to have some set criteria and ethically and morally justifiable way of actually making decisions, so that individual physicians and individual hospitals are not left morally distressed about how they handle the allocation of resources. So some type of criteria put down with some leeways for people under special circumstances would enable people to have some ethically and morally justifiable way of doing this.
So saying matching values with pragmatism in trying to meet the larger goods rather than trying to stick to your standard way, but then on that basis develop guidelines which you can actually practice. That was very helpful, Anu. Are there any other questions to Anu on this list?
No, I don't think so.
Cherry, thank you for your presentation. As a physician, one of the difficulties that I faced in the studies that we were involved in was on the issue of consent. And how do you handle consent, say in the community, or a patient is in the hospital, they're on oxygen, the family is at home, the patient doesn't have control of the process of admission. They are extremely worried that something may happen to them, and there are various ways in which confidentiality is already being affected in terms of the healthcare itself. So we were part of another study in which we had only a 14% acceptance of entry into the study because of all the issues of taking. So while all the issues that you brought up are very important, how we conduct a trial, in actual practice in doing a study has been very challenging in the midst of a pandemic. So I want you to comment on these two things, on the issue of taking consent and how do we meet the actual challenge when we are meeting with the patient and the family. And the second is that as physicians are involved in the midst of a pandemic where people are dying, how do we actually do good research? I found it quite challenging.
Yep. Thanks, Anand. I think both of those are really important questions. So consent is about communication and trust. So what happens in India much more than in other places is that people don't trust research because the picture that has been projected of research is we are going to be turned into guinea pigs, that unknown treatments that may have the potential for harm will be tried on us. There's also this idea that, why would a doctor want to try a new thing? They are supposed to know what to do. So both of these play against participation in research. In many other parts of the world, the functioning of an academic medical center is reviewed based on how many of their patients are actually in clinical trials. The greater the percentage of patients that are on clinical trials, the more highly ranked that institution is as an academic institution. So that requires a huge change in mindset from being a provider of care today to being the provider of care today and the developer of care tomorrow. And that is contingent on us internalizing that and then communicating that to people who come to us for care and we ask them to be on trials. We found that it takes a long time to build trust. So we work with communities a lot. And once you've built that trust, people know that whatever you do, you're making sure that their interests are protected first, not that your research is protected. So we haven't had issues with recruitments in the community, but I think these are challenges that can only be overcome with an understanding of the importance of research, of communication, making sure that you are clear, transparent, and that communication is an ongoing process. You get consent today, but that does not mean you stop communicating about what else is happening in the field of research that you are conducting, what the new treatments are, what other people are thinking about. This is actually very challenging to do. And what I find is the best way to do it is, what would you want to know if you were a participant in the trial? Obviously, we come from privileged backgrounds. We have a greater degree of understanding, but I know that I would want whoever was recruiting me into the clinical trial to keep me informed of what things were going, make me a partner. I think that's critical, and that's the only way that we are going to be able to get consent. People who know how to communicate, people who do it well, and function in a community where research is regarded as part of your responsibilities. So the other question was around how do you know what to do in the context of when you're trying to handle so many different things in the pandemic? Protocols and people who are trained on protocols. Once, when I started out, every protocol we developed was an individual protocol for that study. After we started doing many, many more trials, I found that protocols all have similar elements. So if you have people who are familiar with the idea of the protocol for the clinical trial, then most of the elements are so common that they will be able to deliver. Do not place that responsibility on doctors. Place it on people whose job it is to coordinate the clinical trial. That may be a doctor, but it becomes their responsibility and not the responsibility of the entire team that is trying to deliver the clinical care and also participate in research. Minimize the burdens of research on people who are responsible for care. What is it that you can do? You can just, protocols pay attention to that. Where a doctor is required, you make sure that they have enough time, enough people available to be able to do that, but minimize that as much as possible.
One more question is, you have been involved in many presentations on the vaccines, and would you like to comment on the specific issues of conducting ethics of vaccine trials, and what we, how do, as physicians who are involved in care, and we're going to be providing opportunity for people to enroll in trials, would you like to speak about what we should keep in our mind in terms of the ethical issues for these studies?
For vaccine trials, vaccines are given to healthy people, right? So the bar for safety for vaccines is very high. And then the trial has to make sure that people don't, are informed about risks and benefits. This is a new platform or this is not a new platform. In previous studies, this has been seen with this particular kind of vaccine. But more than that, you have to tell people, we don't know if you've got the vaccine or the placebo. You need to make sure that you continue all the NPIs that you have been doing so far and not unnecessarily expose yourself to infection. Because I think, people think that when you're doing a vaccine trial, you actually want people to get infected so that you get an outcome from the trial. And I think it is unethical to make sure that if you don't emphasize that you need to continue with the NPIs, no matter what happens, okay? And then side effects and monitoring. Some side effects, most side effects are pretty soon after you receive the vaccine dose, but just to make sure that you can inform the investigating team in case you have anything that seems to be a concern. So other than that, I think vaccine trials are, because you do it sort of cold, right? It's not in the middle of managing treatment, managing everything else. The ethical issues are fewer in trials.
Thank you, Cherry. I think there's several questions on Cherry. There's one more. Would you like to read it out?
Yeah. It's a question for Dr. Gagandeep. Could you give us a rough idea of the timeline and provenance of the vaccine that will be used in India? many of us have been recruited by taking names and details of all healthcare workers in our hospitals.
So the vaccines that are being developed in India, the first vaccine that will go through phase 3 trials is Covaxin, because they're starting their phase 3 now. But we may actually have the AstraZeneca Serum Institute of Vaccine or the Gamaleya vaccine earlier, because these vaccines, we will use the phase 3 data from other countries. And in India, only a safety and immunogenicity study will be done. If that is the case, you could look at having the AstraZeneca Serum Institute vaccine potentially by the end of this year or beginning of next year. Gamaleya, I think, will take a little longer because they haven't started their immunogenicity studies in India. And Covaxin is just starting to recruit, and we will see that not before April, May, or thereabouts. I don't think they will be able to accrue cases that quickly. It's feasible, but unlikely.
There's another question for Dr. Cherry.
Cherry, last. One more question.
Sure.
Last
The
one.
last
yeah.
one.
There's another question for Dr. Gagandeep. It says, how can we accommodate ethically in case of administrating effective intervention after approval to placebo group in terms of late effect?
So I actually answered that question in the chat, but basically when you look at when you give an effective intervention to the placebo group, essentially you're making sure that they've received the intervention, and that's absolutely the appropriate way to go. I understand the concern about late side effects. Early side effects will have been seen early on. But if there are late effects of any kind, I think the only way to do it is not in the context of a randomized clinical trial. This is, unless your trial is powered for that outcome, you should treat those questions as separate questions from the ones that are addressed in the RCT.
Thank you, Cherry. Thank you very much. Good. Sushil, do you?
There were some questions for me. Can acts of omissions and commissions be justified as per the Epidemic Act? And so while the Epidemic Act and the Disaster Management Act seems to give tremendous power to the government to do whatever they want to, but many of you would have noticed that courts, including the Supreme Court, has taken action on various issues, on the migrant issue, on the issue of PPE, on the issue of overcharging by hospitals, on the issue of mishandling of patient care and not allowing people to perform last rites for their dead relatives. And so I think the courts there, we do have recourse to acts of omissions or commissions that would be considered unethical, and so the courts would look at the principle of reasonableness and proportionality, and I think that's what the Supreme Court has done in certain situations. There's another question: does the Telemedicine Act restrict itself to the pandemic time? I don't know, but I would imagine that even though it's brought in for this particular time, it's probably will go beyond the pandemic time. It may be better developed in future. Regarding some leaders not wearing a proper mask, and it's not only happening in India. And so to be a good teacher or a leader, one needs to practice what is being preached, and I think that kind of covers that question. The Epidemic Act is applicable to all people in India. So it doesn't matter if you're on contract or if you're on a regular employment. It applies across the board to everyone.
Sushil, I want you to comment on this issue of the media gagging. And from a public health perspective, so you're both, speaking from the perspective of a legal expert as well as a community physician. So how do you see that the way, the lack of adequate information of what was happening on the ground, would that have been counterproductive, you think, in how we handle the epidemic? So I want you to comment on this issue of media transparency in the time of a pandemic. What is your thoughts on that?
So I think what that is directed is towards a plethora of fake news and a lot of wrong information that is going on. But unfortunately, that could be used to actually restrict sharing of essential information that would actually help people to make decisions and actually help in the control of the pandemic. And so, in my understanding and my opinion, we should not be gagged. We do not need to actually have permission from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to share accurate news. But if one was to actually send and forward messages and information without verifying the facts, that could lead to problems, which is, I think, under there in the Information Technology Act.
So the other question, see, one way or one approach to handling the pandemic was a legal route. So if you look at, say, the lockdown, under the Disaster Act, and it was a more strong arm kind of way of public health. And so I want you to just talk a little bit about this idea of the state playing a very legal route in how it handled the pandemic, which restricted doctors, restricted public as a way approach to public health, versus some other approach which may have been more community based, like say in Kerala. So where do you see this thing where this legal route to public health and the implication, how do we think about that?
I think from any government's perspective, it's much easier to have these hardcore acts which give them tremendous powers to implement what they think is the right way. But then what happens if what they're doing is not the right way? So there are major issues there. I think Cherry was mentioning that what we need is good information being shared and good community involvement where people are party to this whole issue of trying to control the epidemic within the country, and where every citizen takes part in and does their role to actually address this pandemic that's affecting all of us. Many people really appreciate the way that Kerala has handled it, because they've diversified their control to a very local level and involved the local wards. And they have done extremely well over there, where they're able to actually have local government people monitoring people who have come in from outside areas. They go check in on them, and it's quite amazing what Kerala has been able to do, where there's tremendous public participation, and they've had the experience of previous outbreaks of Nipah. And I think we are seeing that again in Taiwan and in Vietnam and is it Hong Kong, I think, who've had past experiences with outbreaks where the people are more accepting of their role in actually controlling this.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that are coming in? Or we'll wind up. I think we are come to the end of our session. And I really want to thank all the three presenters, Anu, Sushil, and Gagandeep. I think Anu's really spoken for the need to understand the ethical issues around the pandemic and the way that we need to respond in future also, and the hope that there will be more discussion about ethical frameworks to help us digest and understand what we have been through. And there's not been adequate kind of discussions on this, and hopefully we need, even in our education, in our undergraduate and postgraduate, in the wider discussion, these issues need to come in. And Cherry's made a very strong plea for the participation both of doctors and of patients and the need for ethical research in the context of a pandemic. And I think that the other point she brought up in the discussion was about the public understanding that in the context of a wider discussion about research, that we can encourage people to participate in trials and the public knowledge. So thank you, Cherry. And I think Sushil brought up the issue of understanding the laws which have been governing the response of the government and the public health, and the limitations of such approaches which have affected us, the whole society actually, in so many ways, and also how to think about these things. And so I want to thank you all for joining today's session. I think in a way, I think it needs to be the start of a wider discussion. If we look back at the HIV epidemic, I think it really, the consideration of the ethical issues around the HIV epidemic really forced us to rethink medicine, and maybe a lot of new things came on ethics. And I think that the pandemic has affected the whole world in so many ways. And I hope that that will force us also to rethink how to practice medicine in an ethical manner. So thank you for joining us, and we'll send you notices of the upcoming COVID lectures, the Pulse lectures, and I think this is CMC's effort to do something which has been talked about today, which is really that if we want a good medicine in a pandemic, that information should be out, and there should be wider public, more transparent and democratic discussion if we have to really deal with epidemics. So it's been arguing really for a democratic way of doing medicine. So thank you for joining, and wish you all well. For those of you who are still in the midst of an escalating curve, we wish you well. Here we seem to be on the downward trend, but we're not down and out yet, still going. But I think we're more relieved here and relaxed, because I think that stress that we were talking about is considerably less. So good evening to all of you. Any final words you want to say?
Yeah, your last comment, Anand, made me remember, I think it's Winston Churchill who said is, don't let a good crisis go to waste. And so there are tremendous lessons that we as the health care community really need to look at and try and push forward in the next few years.